Okay. Good morning to everyone and welcome to History Matters. And so does coffee. Really matters this morning. Some mornings it matters more than others. Somehow this morning it's extra strong. Today, as advertised on Twitter, we're going to be talking about national character. And I'll define what that means and then play around with that idea a little bit in a moment. It's an important one always, but this week made me think about it particularly. However, before I launch into that conversation, I turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Good to see everybody's virtual smiling faces. That's what we'll go with today. Rules of the game are as follows. We do ask that you use chat. Please use it as much as you or as little as you'd like. We love seeing you and hearing from you and seeing all your great ideas. And you are, of course, the fastest link finders in the world.
It's true.
But as always, keep it germane to the conversation as much as possible and, of course, family friendly. If you do have questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A. That's where we like to take questions a lot easier. That way I don't miss anything that happens to come through chat because you all talk vociferously. So please put those in Q&A and I will be more than happy to ask your questions if I can possibly get to them. And as always, if you do like what we do here at the National Council of History Education, please join us at www.ncheteach.org and click around. Just one quick plug. Today, we have a fantastic second annual Equity Summit coming up next week. You do not want to miss it. It is a great opportunity to hear some incredible keynotes, incredible panelists, incredible virtual field trips. It should be really, really exciting. It'd be all done on Zoom. And yes, you can sign up for it. And then if you can't make it, you can go back and watch the videos. So if you absolutely can't make it, you can go back and get the credit and see it at your convenience. So look forward to seeing some of you or all of you there. And with that, I will turn it back over to Joanne. Thanks.
Okay. Change view here. Okay. That's what I feel like I've been using Zoom for a year, and somehow, no matter what I do, I'm always getting the view mixed up. Okay. So national character. I thought of it. So I guess the beginning of my statement here is I had some emotional reactions to the news. And I know that since I've been doing this, I've been saying, if you have emotional reactions to something, pause and ask why. And if the person making the pronouncement or giving you the information is probably trying to get a rise out of you in some way, either for political benefit or whatever. So I did pause. I took my own advice. However, what I found, and the two things that got me upset were the response to Simone Biles' withdrawal from the Olympics and the response to the January 6th hearing. So not the events themselves, but the response. And I, on the one hand, wasn't surprised. We're beyond extremely polarized at this moment, and we're at a point where often what separates us is one side really aggressively, emotionally trying to poke at the other side. So I knew I was being poked. But the poking, what was happening, I thought was really interesting. The people who were, and I don't know what the politics are of the people who were angry about Simone Biles withdrawing, but they were basically saying in one way or another, she's weak, she's cowardly, she embarrassed the United States. Someone, I will not say the name because I don't want to give this person any credit, called her a narcissist sociopath, which suggests to me that person does not understand either of those two words. However, it was a really powerful, strong, angry, personal response to her decision to withdraw for really good reasons, right? We've now understand. I mean, part of what I think gave some people ample ground to have that kind of response was that initially it came out mental health, which a lot of people jumped on as soft or weak or whatever. And then it became clear what the nature of that was. So in and of itself, it was fine. When the nature of it became clearer, I think some people maybe backpedaled a little bit at any rate. That the nature of that anger surprised me, which was then kind of repeated. I watched the January 6th hearing. I found it upsetting. And I watched the whole thing because I felt that I needed to. I needed to witness that. I felt that the evidence was strong, beyond strong, that something important happened that day. And the men who were testifying were very clearly sincere and upset. And then, of course, I'm sure many of you have seen this, the response by some on the right was that they're crisis actors, that it's fake, that they're playing up what happened, it wasn't that bad, blah, blah, blah. Now, that is a lot of blah, blah, blah. But the fact that that kind of blah, blah, blah is floating around in the public sphere, again, on one hand is kind of shocking. It isn't. I know we're in the moment where that's not shocking, and that in and of itself is shocking. But the fact that that happened, we all probably would have predicted it. However, those two things happening near each other suggested to me not only that we have polarized different visions of what the United States should be, and I've talked a lot of times here about polarization before, an extreme polarization, but that in a sense, that idea, I guess it got me to the roots of that idea, which is we have two very different views about, for lack of a better idea, I'm going to come back to this at the end. I'm going to say the soul of the republic, the nature of our nation, or in other words, our national character. Now, I recognize that national character is a broad word. When I thought of it, I did what I always do, which is go back to the founding. And I'm going to go back there in a moment because they, of course, thought about this a lot. It can mean a number of things, and I'm going to talk about a few of them this morning. It partly has to do with the nature or spirit or character of the nation. It's kind of the feeling of the nation, the culture of the nation, the reputation of the nation. That's part of it. But there are a lot of things that build into that. So it's a little bit amorphous as a term, which I think is good and bad. But regardless of how we define it, it's important and was recognized as being important from the beginning of the Republic. So let's start there and sort of work our way up to the present. And I've talked a lot before. I also realize I've now said many times before, I've talked a lot before. This is what happens when you do 69 episodes. You're like, like 5 other times. But in this case, I have talked many times about the self-consciousness of the American founding and the fact that people involved in particularly the political realm, but really every realm in that time, were aware that they were starting something, and and starting something fragile and unusual, and that assumption shaped their response to the moment. And in thinking about the reputation of this brand new nation and how to enable it to stand on an international stage and how to encourage Americans to actually respect and accept a brand new national government, they thought a lot about national character. Sometimes they even called it that. Not all the time, but sometimes Hamilton did. Surprise! And I'll come back to him in a moment. So, I've talked about things that they worried about, like Washington worrying about how fancy his table settings were when he's president, and that he was very focused on having a sort of medium style, right? Not too fancy, not too plain, but medium style. That people were worried about how small our Republican politicians ought to dress. They shouldn't look like aristocrats, like European aristocrats, but they have to look like elite men somehow who deserve respect. What's that going to be? How many horses should you have with your carriage, and how much how many become monarchical, and all of those things. Those are the things I love to talk about because on the one hand, there's humor to them, and they're so inherently human, and they knock these guys off their pedestals in a really effective way, and all of that is good. But what really fascinates me about that is what that represents is political power holders wrestling with what American character will or should be. Even then, there were different ideas, right? So there are people who are pushing for a more monarchical style and saying, we need to be this way. And then there's other people saying, we don't want to be monarchical, you're a monarchist. So at the time, there's never been a golden moment of unity in the United States, ever. But that goes all the way back. And that's true with questions of national character as well. However, what people would have agreed upon at the time was that worrying about national character and establishing national character was important. Now, as a historian, sometimes the quickest way to get a read on national character is to look through the eyes of foreign visitors. So one thing that I did a lot when I was writing my first book was I looked at the letters and writings and memoirs of French visitors to the United States in the 1780s and 1790s to see what they thought of the new nation. And of course, they were pegged into it. America and France were allies during the Revolution, so and France itself is going through some kind of revolutionary fervor. So the two countries had a lot in common. In one way or another, many people assumed that they were allied. That becomes an issue in 1793, but we won't talk about that right now. But at any rate, the French are watching and visiting. And what many of them said, and there's one quote that stands out, actually two quotes that stand out. And I could dig my book up and I could figure out where I found them, but I won't do that because I remember them because they were so striking. So one French visitor said that it looked to him like Americans were walking on a tightrope, and that they didn't really quite know where their next foot should be placed, which I loved because, first of all, because Americans, Washington and William McClay, the Pennsylvania senator I've quoted before, and I think James Madison, any number of people, all at one point or another in the first year or two, the government said something like, I walk on hollow ground, I walk on dangerous ground, the world is hollow, the earth, whatever. In one way or another, over and over and over and over again, people talked about the fact that their footing seemed insecure. And so this Frenchman says, it looks like that, which I love. And I'm going to mention this now and not go into it, but ask me maybe during the after party how that actually played into a project I did for the Hamilton musical people, because it did, but I'm not going to talk about that now. At any rate, so one observer says, okay, whatever the national character is, they're thinking a lot about it because they look like they don't quite know what they're doing. It might be the same observer, it might be another, but what he described as to what he saw in the United States, he said that they're living in a condition of British rust. Another fascinating thing, because what they're saying is, yeah, it's kind of British, but it's like weird, old, doesn't represent really what they are, and yet they're clinging to it kind of spirit. Again, that's a kind of statement about, national character and what the nation is beaming out in a fascinating kind of way. So foreign visitors often say things like that, and they often don't have the qualms that Americans might have about making such pronouncements. And so for that reason, an outsider making pronouncements is always a useful thing. But at any rate, the assumption in this time period was, and this has to do with the carriages and the plates and the clothing, whatever the people in power do, how they behave, how they dress, how they treat each other, their manners, their living arrangements, that will shape the nation. Why? Because other people will look to them and follow their example, and the character of the nation will thus be stamped. So there's an assumption there that Americans will look to their leaders and take their cues, any number of different kinds of cues, from their leaders, and that could profoundly shape the nation, the character of the nation, the culture of the nation, maybe even the grounding of the nation. I'm going to come back to that idea. But from the beginning, people understand the importance of national character. They don't know what it is yet. It's fragile and a weird kind of experiment. And people in power have a role in thinking about what that character is. Now, Hamilton is, and I'm sure this is, there are more people than Hamilton who say something like this and use the phrase national character, but it's his letters that are in my brain. So I'm bringing to you a Hamilton letter. And I remember it because of some way in which it refutes the duel, what people say about the duel. So at some point, when he's Secretary of the Treasury, he makes a pronouncement and he says something like, national character, to neglect or ignore national character is to commit political suicide, right? That's the heart of the nation, national character. Now, I've remembered that quote because he says to ignore national character is to commit political suicide. And then I think about the duel where, in essence, he says, to ignore these kinds of insults would be to commit political suicide. So the word suicide is kind of what I grab at. But the larger point there, which is that national character is at the heart of what a country is, that rings true with everything that I'm saying here, and was particularly true when the nation was new and they were trying to figure out what that character was. Now, jump forward in time to another highly polarized time in the pre-Civil War years, maybe decade or two, and you have a different kind of discussion, but still a discussion that is partly about interpreting the Constitution and partly about the fundamental basis of the nation, whether slavery will be part of that or not, and partly about what kind of nation it will be, what the spirit and character of the nation will be. And there's something of a sort of agricultural urban dimension to that, but slavery itself and the stamp of slavery is part of that, right? So Southerners themselves refer to slavery as their peculiar institution. In my book, when I found Southerners often, getting upset and slugging someone or threatening to slug someone, they were protecting what they saw as their way of life. And they use that phrase, way of life. This is us. This is who we are. This is our way of life. In a sense, that's what they're talking about. Again, this sort of broad, amorphous understanding of character. They were talking about Southern character, but they're also assuming that Southern character is national character. And if it isn't, that's a big problem, right? If somehow it's excluded, and if you're excluding slavery from spreading in the minds of a slaveholding Southerner, that would be saying that slavery and slaveholders are not really a reputable part of the Union. That's an important thing. So again, the slavery debate is about a lot of things, but wrapped up in it, bound up in it, is this larger question about national character, national reputation. And you can see, again, the fact that outsiders, and in this case, Northerners going south and people from other countries visiting the United States and going south, again and again and again and again, and some of them are abolitionists and anti-slavery in their politics, some of them are not. They comment on the nature, the spirit, the feeling of being in the South and being in the North. They feel it. Charles Dickens, in I think 1841, makes a tour of the United States and talks in his, he ultimately publishes a book about his travels, but in his private letters, talks some about the feel of what it's like to be in the South, the character of the South and the character of the North, and for that matter, the character of the West. So as he's reckoning with what he thinks America is, of course, the South and the North and the West are part of what add up to what American national character is. But so when in the lead up to the Civil War, people are screaming about slavery, they're screaming about economics, they're screaming about justice and morality, they're screaming about politics, they're screaming about culture, and they're screaming about and sectionalism, and they're screaming about national character. It's all bound up. I know before, I've talked about how in this period you can't say that domestic affairs and foreign affairs are in these two separate piles, that they're bound together, that anything that was a foreign quarrel was hugely shaped domestic affairs. It's only in time that Americans came to see foreign affairs as something distinct. So, this is in that same spirit, which is we assume somehow that all of those things have separate bundles, economics and politics and culture and character, but they don't. Even constitutional interpretation, not a separate bucket of concerns. I'm going to come back to that idea in a moment. So anyway, the part of what I'm saying here is that national character, yes, it's amorphous, and yes, I'm defining it broadly. And for all of those reasons, and partly the reason why I'm doing it is because it's so important, because it has such profound power, because it's how Americans and people from other countries understand us, and because it's easy to overlook and not think about, and yet it is the stamp of what the United States represents. And the last thing I thought about this morning when I was thinking about what I was going to say was the Constitution. And because I was thinking about the South and I was thinking about slavery, and then I thought, well, that debate is partly a constitutional debate, right? About how do we interpret the Constitution, and how do we, think about property rights, and i.e. slavery, and states' rights. Those are bound up in the fight over slavery, which means that there's a constitutional issue bound up in there as well. But of course, how we interpret the Constitution profoundly shapes national character, right? Again, it's not like there's this separate bucket over here, like we shall talk about the Constitution, and then over here is everybody else, right? Whatever they're doing here is shaping everything. It's not something I think that we, or at least I, don't think about all the time, but once you say it, of course, it seems obvious and true. But I think for that reason, for both of those reasons, it's important to say that we're, in one way or another, we're in a moment, gets us back to where I began with Simone Biles and the January 6th hearing. We're in a moment where we're arguing over the spirit of the nation, how we behave as a nation, who we are as a nation, what we encompass as a nation, how inclusive we are or aren't as a nation, the tone and manner of our politics as a nation, how we treat each other as a nation. All of these things, we're watching them unfold, and we're seeing people become either strategically using them to smack around, or just being wrapped up in them and affected by them, and sort of bursting into conflict. We're in a moment where all of those things are being debated, even not necessarily consciously, but that's where we are. We're talking about, when I guess always in the past, I referred to conflicting visions of what the nation should be. And vision is a pretty broad word, so I think about people on the right and their vision for the nation, and that has a certain view about religion and its role, and it has a certain view about inclusion or exclusion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And on the left has a different view about those things, and those are different visions of what the United States should be, but go one step deeper. And in a sense, we're talking about the soul of the Republic, the character of our country, what we assume about our country living in it, and what the rest of the world assumes about our country looking on. That too is not a separate issue. We live in, and this again, obvious statement, but needs to be said, we live in a global time. And the pandemic is the ultimate example of that, right? The pandemic doesn't care about national boundaries. Pandemic doesn't care about anything, right? Pandemic is just like, I'm spreading. Nice of you to have different flags, but I don't know why I'm making the pandemic come to life. But my larger point is, the pandemic is the most global thing of all, and we can say different nations are responding in different ways, and that shapes its spread. But ultimately, it's just everywhere spreading. That's it. It's the ultimate global thing. Our response shows just how global it is, because in one way or another, we're all dependent on each other as nations and as sections of the United States to confront it, and we are not able to manage to do that. But the larger point here is, we need to think about what things like mocking the police, or attacking Simone Biles or any number of other things says about the spirit or the character of our nation, which sounds like a soft, kind of cushy, not very important thing. Just like sometimes when I talk about culture, I assume people are like, that's cute. Let's talk about politics. Part of my point here is no, it actually, in one sense, it's everything. National character. In some senses, it's everything. It's what we are talking about. It's what we are arguing over. And all of those other things I mentioned a moment ago are all bound up in it. Now, it's something human, right? National character can be formed by all kinds of things, but we experience it and we can shape it. So it's also possible to say national character has to do with who we are and how we see ourselves and how we interact with each other and what we expect of our government and how we respond to things that feel out of bounds. That's part of national character. I never have gotten on here and suggested that I have grand solutions to any of the problems that we're in. But I find it, if not comforting, at least important to state that questions of reputation and character of the nation are not floating above us, but we live in it and we can shape it. It's a human thing that can be shaped, maybe by us, definitely by the people we put in office. So I guess the last thing I'll say here before opening things up for question is when we say that we're living at a moment where there's a crisis of democracy, where there's a crisis over voting rights, and both of those things are true, we're also saying that we're living in a crisis of national character. And democracy gets shaped by it, the existence of democracy or not, right? Democracy is grounded on the idea of ideally fair contests and exchange on a level playing field, ideally, not necessarily really, but trying, at least it's held out there as a possibility, and a shared set of rules, the Constitution, right? Democracy, among other things, is bound up in all of those things. So, and voting rights, whoever we put in office is going to shape national character. So again, all of those things, those vitally important things that are truly in crisis, voting rights are under attack, democracy is under attack. Those things both fundamentally shape national character, and national character is who we are. So part of my reason for talking about this today is I want everyone to recognize the stakes and the breadth and the nature of the moment we're in. Okay, I will stop there and open things up for questions. Oh, mug. Okay. I'm going to be like episode 890.
Run there without
Carolee and Tom did what they're supposed to do. Okay. I hadn't thought about it. I had a panic moment. I went to the kitchen, I got my coffee in a different mug, right? And then I was like, oh, I can't use this mug today. And I was like, what mug? What mug? And then I remembered this one.
Oh, yes.
Telling about the South. It was a conference about Southern character, right? So I was so proud of myself. I was like, not only is it the right mug, but I own a mug that I could apply to this. This was from, when is this from? 1994. I think it was my beginning year in grad school. It was early in my graduate studies, and I went to this conference. And it shows, you can't tell it, but it's UVA, a 19th century image of UVA. Oh, maybe you can see it. At any rate,
but yeah,
that's the logic of Gina says, of course, I own a mug about national character. Yeah. Okay. Matt, we moved to Matt and the background.
Yeah, so no big, I did excuse me, I did go for the dad joke ultimately, which is, of course, this is Uncle Sam, who is our national character. So, so that's the dad joke for the week. Is this Uncle Sam is our national character, so that's why I went with him.
Okay, I get it now. It took me a minute. He is character in many of the word. He is our national. He's a little scary too when you look at him.
A little bit scary, yes.
Yeah. Yes. Gina's good. Gina says, "But a rim shot."
For the record, the other one, I was going back and forth. There was a distinct possibility I was going to go with Emily Post's house, as so the for who
How
wrote,
We Behave.
yes, How We Behave and National
No, this,
Discourse.
I think you went the right way, and particularly someone just said, good dad joke.
Yes, thank you, thank you.
Jacqueline. Yep, that's exactly what it is, and I love that.
We needed a good dad joke. It's the middle of the summer. We just needed a little bit of levity, so that's what I went with. So, well, we have great questions as usual.
Excellent.
Tim, let's start with this one. This is a good one to start with. Tim Keene wants to know, what are some historical examples of when the character of the nation has been seen in a negative light from the outside?
Well, I mean, I think in a sense, one way to answer that is think about supremely unattractive moments like McCarthyism, for example.
Right.
Moments
Right.
when we go to an extreme. And it's really obviously extreme, not like, oh, I disagree with that moment. They are doing this kind of politics instead of that. But I mean, really moving in a direction that suggests a change of the fundamental nature of government. And McCarthyism changed the spirit of the government, of the nation, in a way. So I would say that's a moment. I mean, you could that's a more complicated question, because you could also say that America's behavior during world wars and what the nation does, right? Some people would have responded to that in one way or another, other countries negatively. So I think, as I suggested in my comments, part of what I love about trying to see what people from other countries are saying about the United States at a given time is that you can't necessarily predict, like McCarthyism, yeah, people are going to be upset about it, but you can't always predict what they're going to be offended by. So some things are obvious, but some things aren't. And so that is a thing I very often do. I did it in my second book as well, was try to see what outsiders from other countries are saying about what's going on in the United States, because they're going to say, what the what? Like Americans might be like, yeah, we're beating each other up in Congress. And then, Charles Dickens is like, what? So that's a broad answer, but my answer, I suppose, is partly if something seems questionable to you. I see someone writing like Watergate. There are all kinds of things that Americans, that other countries would pause and question about the United States. We're now in a moment, and have been for years, right, that our the way we're treating other nations and our decision to back away from some of our relationships with other nations and back out of agreements with other nations, right, that has made some people have a strong view, negative view in other countries about the United States. So it's an interesting question, because it can be answered in some expected ways, and then I think in some unexpected ways. It's a great research topic in any given moment for that reason.
Okay, so Dave A asks a loaded question, so I'm going to rephrase it, Dave, with apologies, because I think there's an interesting little nugget here, which is the Southerners in the 1850s. So we're going to turn our attention to the 1850s Civil War for a couple questions, just FYI to the audience and to Joanne, so she can prepare her brain. The Southerners in the 1850s believed that they had the right, quote unquote, national character. And I'm not going to read the second half of the question because it's a little bit polemic, but I wondered if we could tease that idea out a little bit, that in the 1850s, when you were writing Field of Blood, that let me rephrase that, the era in which you were writing
about the era I was writing about.
Yes, there we go. Because anyway, but this idea that that the Northerners had believed that they had sort of the right national character. Southerners had. Can we tease that out just a little bit and just sort of clarify? Is that a myth? Is that a reality? Is that did that do more?
I think there was reality to that for sure, and I think that's particularly true about the South. That had this very strong, beginning in the 1830s, resistance to slavery, national organized resistance to slavery, which they took, rightly so, as an attack on who and what they were and the character of the South. So for sure, the South thought that way. One interesting way that I remember thinking about this issue was in the couple of years before the Civil War. I can't remember now who said it, but it was a member of Congress, Southern member of Congress, who went back home and was speaking to constituents at some kind of a speech. And he said something like, because they were thinking about what happens if we end up really going to war with each other. He says, we've all been in Congress with these Northerners, right? We know what they are. They're weak.
Mm-hmm.
They're namby-pamby. They have no power at all. The North is inferior to us. It is of inferior character to us. The women in the North are inferior to our women, but it was fascinating because the quote, and I'm not going to do it justice, was something like, you've all seen what Northerners are like in Congress, right? They're no threat. Like the North is nothing. So even some of the Southern bravado going, always a mistake if you're going into a war to be like, we have this one, because like every TV show you've ever watched, that's a sure sign that you're doomed. But in this case, some of that has to do with assumptions about what the North and Northerners are. So yeah, I do think that the South believed that about themselves. And I think for that reason, when someone attacked or insulted the South in Congress, that some of the personal response to that has to do with this kind of question that you're asking. I didn't go into it that much in my comments, but again, one of the things that struck me about the response to Simone Biles and the January 6th hearing response was how personal people were responding,
Mm-hmm.
right? They were personally offended in the case of Biles. And in the case of the hearing, they had a personal guttural reaction, as did I, of a different kind. So the fact that these sorts of things feel really personal and yet are really national is another angle of this. And I think the Southerners who become offended at people who say something negative about the South, that's sort of on the fringes of this idea.
So, and I know this next question, this is my next question, and I know this is not your area of expertise, so feel free to tell me to move on. I'm happy to do so. But I was kind of curious, how did that idea of sort of Southern, I don't know, dominance isn't the right word, but you know what I mean? Like, how did that change or alter or I don't know, become imbued with other ideas of national interests following the Civil War? So and and sort of in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, we, as you documented in the 1850s, we led up, there were these clear north south sort of ideas about who was best. And following the Civil War, then, like, how did that change, or did it change, or are we still feeling the effects of that today? So
did it change is the question, right? So
right.
How did the South behave during Reconstruction, and how did it behave towards Black Southerners?
Mm-hmm.
Ask a question about how the South behaves about itself, and when there's friction, and that tells you some of the ways in which the South still has its own sense of what it is and what's right. And so does the North. I mean, so in this case, different sections have a different feeling. But think about civil rights, right? And think about where that gets resisted. If you're resisting civil rights, you're saying something about what you value or don't value,
Mm-hmm.
and you're thus saying something about what you think the nation should be. So I think look for conflict points, sectional conflict points, and sort of dig down into what they represent. And in one way or another, the different sides in that debate are saying, this is what I think the nation is, and I'm on that side. It's like in the 1790s, when Federalists and Republicans, they both said, people on both sides, this is an actual both sides, on both sides said, we represent the views of the American public. We are what America is, and they are evil, self-interested people out to serve only themselves. Each side said that about the other, right? Mm-hmm. Well, and not for political strategic purpose because they believed it, right? That was what they assumed was what the nation should be. So this kind of has echoes of that in it as well.
So just to take this idea just one last step, and this is Becky's question: is are we still feeling the repercussions? I can read today. The repercussions of the national character schism from the Civil War is what is driving so much of the division. Would we have been? I'm not going to read that last one, but is that sort of where we're at? And then to add to that, Dale asks a few questions later. Did Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith confirm the Southern character in the early 20th century? So I guess let's take those conflict points and extend it into today, because I think ultimately that's where you wanted to go today.
Yeah. To deal with the latter half first, there are all kinds of things that are statements about Southern character or Northern character. In the case of Southern character and what the nation is, Birth of a Nation is one. Actually, Heather Cox Richardson and I talked about this in the live episode we did, I think the week before last. We talked about Gone with the Wind and what that showed and what that represented and what that said and how Americans took it. So yeah, we still see that going on. And again, culture is a really handy way to do it. I think I said this in that episode because it's subtle and it can be sort of beneath the surface, and yet it's really powerful, and it really shapes what you ultimately are. The lens through which you're looking can be shaped by culture. Remind me that the first half of the question, now that I very happily answered the second half.
1 second, I just dismissed it. Becky was asking, are we still feeling the repercussions of that national character schism today, or are we feeling it in different ways? Maybe is a different way to put it. And then what is driving that division?
Right. Well, what is driving the? Well, okay, so that's a complex question, and it has.
Yeah.
I will say, while racism is a problem everywhere, racism has a particular character in the South, and that has never changed. Right? It's different. It's not the same as it always was across time. Nothing is the same across time, but that fact, the stamp of slavery, and what it represents, and the assumptions that undergird it. Yeah, you could say, that persists. There's a book. It's actually lurking behind me. I can't remember the name of it. If you're interested in that after party, I can get it. It's a book by, I believe, a sociologist, and what it's about, which is why I have it, it's about honor, Southern honor. And it talks about how that idea, in a very old sense, moves on and continues. The ways in which modern life, Southerners have a distinctive way of thinking about personal honor that's not necessarily better or worse, but different from how other parts of the Union think about it. Now, obviously, those kinds of big, broad pronouncements have all kinds of holes in them, so as a historian, when you're making those pronouncements, or at least for me, I will sometimes say, like, many people, it's often, one common thought. Like, I find some way to hedge it in so that I'm not saying all Southerners think this. But it's an interesting book because, again, it's talking about the various sorts of things. No, it isn't actually Bertram Wyatt Brown's Southern Honor, which is a really interesting book, but that book is really about the 19th century. He writes later books that play with the Southern character and how that lives on. But he was actually a wonderful, supportive kind of mentor to me, Bertram Wyatt Brown. And there's a story that goes along with that. But that's actually not the book that I'm thinking of. I just can't remember the name of the book. Short book, yellow writing on the front.
We're not going to make you get up, so we'll
no, that's after party
somewhere else. Tom, actually, this is a nice sort of segue into maybe some broader questions, which will lead us into the end of our time here today. But Tom McAndrew wanted to know: are there differences between national character and national identity, and if so, what and how?
Well, the quick answer, my guttural response is yes, but now I have to decide why I think that. Because I think by by definition, national identity is very personal, is in really in us, right? Our national identity. Who am I as an American? Whereas national character is how we think about our country. So, and this might be a, you know, blurry kind of division, but I feel like national character is broader and more sweeping, and encompasses more within it. National identity has to do with who we are, and they're not unrelated, and there's a lot of overlap, but I don't think they're the same thing. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's kind of, if I, really good question. So if I had more time to ponder and write, I would probably come up with more of an answer. But I think they're related and even overlap, but I don't think they're necessarily the same thing.
Well, take your time. We'll wait.
No pressure at all.
I know I do this to you quite frequently, where I ask like these incredibly heady questions that.
But you guys always ask.
They're fantastic questions,
They
and
are.
but sometimes it probably takes a little more thought than on the spot to work through. Well, Lawrence had, and then so that maybe this gets into some of these ideas about how national character is sort of codified and throughout our culture, our political culture, our social culture. Hollywood has produced some great or iconic films about American national character and values, like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, To Kill a Mockingbird, etc. How do you think these shape our vision of national character? And what other films or media do you think have been influential for good or bad?
Oh, wow. Well, I definitely think, I think that's a two-way street. So I think popular culture and film and TV shows shape what we think about the nation, but also are profoundly shaped by what we think, right? Because popular culture, in part, is sometimes trying to give a particular message, also trying to make money, right? So trying to appeal to people in addition to offer some kind of a message. So yeah, I think the short answer to that is for sure, popular culture, any kind of popular culture, shapes what we think and then is shaped by what we think. A great example of this, at least, is Shaped by Us. And I didn't realize this until well into the pandemic. I must have watched every dystopian movie and TV show on TV. I was like, oh, there's another dystopian show about the world blowing up and it being horrible. Oh, here's another one. There's a huge genre of dystopian movies, which makes perfect sense for the moment that we're in, and which is reflective of the things we're thinking about and worrying about, and reflects sort of where we are, but also kind of can't help but shape what we're thinking about where we are as well. So that's part of the interesting aspect to me of culture, is the sort of give and take of it. As far as putting my finger on a movie that one movie that has a big impact, that's harder. I did, when I worked at the Library of Congress, we did a big exhibition on the bicentennial of Congress, and we did we created, and then it was never shown for a variety of reasons. We created a film about Congress in the movies, and what it was about was related to this, right? Which is, what does Congress look like in the movies, and what does it suggest about what it is as a body, and what does that say about us? It was actually really interesting. My good friend Ron Bloomer, who normally bird sits my birds, he can't right now, is a documentary filmmaker, and his wife Muffy Meyer, and they worked on, I don't know if Muffy was involved in that project, but Ron was, created this film, worked on it, created it, and then we never showed it. I don't know if anyone's ever seen it except us, but it really, this idea was behind it, which is, what do things add up to, right? If you have, and we, again, for reasons of making money, it's always true in culture that, you have one show about something and it works well, and then you have 82 others that are like, oh, well, if he did that, then I can do this too. That says something about where we are, but it shapes what we're thinking about where we are too.
Well, just say out loud, if you would like it ever to be seen, National Council for History Education will be more than happy to live stream it, create a whole event out of it. I'm just going to toss it out there as a
That's interesting.
possibility.
I wonder if they could find it at the Library of Congress.
Okay,
I'm gonna will you remind me about that, Matt? That could be something. I just never haven't thought about that film literally in decades. I think it was called Congress at the Movies. Anyway, remind me, we can stick on maybe a few minutes after the after party to chat about a bunch of things and
Yeah,
maybe. Okay,
that could be something.
cool.
Love it.
Uh,
So I'm going to go off script here for a relatively short question. But I kind of wanted to touch on a word that maybe we dance around when we talk about issues of national identity, national character, and that's jingoism, right? And I'm wondering, and I'm thinking about this in terms of sort of the fabricated blowback, which is kind of the way I look at it about Simone Biles, with this past week, and I wonder if this sort of sense of jingoism plays into that. Like, we cannot show weakness to other foreign countries, and that, and where did that come from in your mind historically? And is that or am I totally off base here?
I have to just say, Dave just said Matt's short question is
It usually is. I have been in education long enough. I can talk.
Oh, but that's good. That's good. So the short version of what you just asked is, give me the short version.
The short version is, did jingoism play into this issue with Simone Biles? And historically, has that always played into the sort of idea that America can't show weakness to other countries?
So I will say yes.
But it's a loaded question. I admit it, but it's
yeah. But I think it's true.
Right.
In different ways. I will say, without giving away next Tuesday's podcast episode, that we don't use the word jingoism, but we address this very issue.
Okay.
Which has to do with the times and ways in which, among other things, America projects itself out. So, but yeah, I do think, and some of that, a lot of nations would do, right? That like, well, we're the best, we're strong, but the United States goes all the way back to a city on a hill, and this sort of idea that, the United States is an exception to every rule and different from every country, and can't fail in any way. I spent a long time on social media saying, guys, please don't assume that we're so exceptional that democracy will be here forever, because that's not the case. But sort of jingoism, we can't show any weakness, is bound up with that as well. And that's, interestingly, that's also personal, right? That's bound up with some of the honor culture things I write about.
Right.
If you're talking about a country showing itself to be weak and people being so personally wounded by that they need to scream, that's a great example of the power of that kind of charge, right? Of weakness or cowardice, and how that gets wrapped up in a way that ultimately, if you think about it, makes no sense in foreign affairs, because we shouldn't be fighting wars over, like, you called me a coward, but that's everything I write about is grounded on that idea, right? You called me a coward, and thus I must potentially kill you. It really shows how those issues of character and identity have a real power.
Marty wants to know, has our true character been revealed as never before due to social media? All these people may have just been underground before, but now there's a platform and a voice for them. Do you think that's true, or do you think this is just a new iteration of a problem that has happened throughout our history?
Well, I think every major shift in communication changes how we see each other, which is, again, one of many sort of basic statements I make, but that is worth thinking about, right? That Americans in the North and South could actually see each other in the press because of the telegraph, and could see what was happening in Washington in a different way because of the telegraph, and that shaped what they thought of the nation. I very much do think, I'm going to come back to what you just said, Gloria, because that's true too. That I very much do. I lost my way. See, Gloria, look what you did. Where was I headed with that? What was I just halfway through my answer? Someone give me a cue. What was I just talking about? I hate when this happens. Matt, do you know?
I do not. I was answering.
Telegraph. Thank you, Emily. Okay.
I was answering a
So
question.
yes, I do. Thank you. I do think that social media in many ways is shaping this moment, because even I find myself, and I'm using Twitter as a teaching tool, and I will see what's on Twitter, and I will respond with despair because I'll be like, what am I seeing? And then I have to remind myself, this isn't everyone. This isn't necessarily the majority or even a huge bunch of people. It's a limited specific group of people, and many of them aren't even real people. So, but I don't think even I forget that sometimes. So yeah, I think that anything that shapes communication between Americans in a dramatic way, any new kind of technology, really fundamentally shapes what Americans think of each other. And we have not fully grappled with social media and what it does to us as a nation. And every conversation we have about the internet and who should have access to what and what kind of regulations we should have and what should Facebook be doing, that's all part of this moment when we just haven't really figured out what it should be and what role it should play and how it's working. That what stopped me before, Gloria stopped me because it was an important point to make. She said, isn't also national character defined by the people who are praising Simone Biles? And yes, absolutely. I didn't mean to suggest that our national character is ultimately entirely defined by the naysayers. I'm just saying the naysayers were the ones that kind of took me aback. So good reminder.
Okay, I was going to totally go in a different direction, but I have one more question on as a follow-up to that, which is, can you talk about authorship when it comes to the problems that exist with the platforms like social media and platforms today? So I'm thinking Michael Wesch, who's a digital anthropologist out of Missouri, and I'm sorry, Kansas State. But he kind of writes about the authorship in many ways in the digital era has changed because it's it's easier to hide things, it's easier to collaborate, it's easy, and very. So I wondered if you could just comment on that as a historian, with like, what is the future going to do with the fact that we may not know who some of these people are?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I can say I've seen it over the years, increasingly in my undergraduate classrooms, because the students will go online and dig around to find information, and in a sense, not surprisingly, have no sense of why one place they go is different from another place, and then they take something and it goes in a paper. And I look at that and I'm like, okay, first of all, that's like Joe in his basement, and why are you telling me what Joe in his basement thinks about this topic? And we've had that conversation. But also, what we see over and over again online and in social media is people taking something from one person and then sticking it out there as theirs. And so I think students have a different understanding of that, right? And I think there's an understanding of plagiarism that we assume to be out there, and that's true. And I think undergraduates, some of them see all the time cutting and pasting. Music does it all the time, right? Everything does it. And it for the most part, people don't comment on it. So, in a way, I don't remember how many years ago it was, but there was some point at which I realized I needed to start talking about plagiarism and footnotes in a totally different way, because the students had a different understanding of texts and authorship and ownership, and that they did something that I remember. One student did something and I was like, oh, like that's plagiarism. But then I talked to the student and she had no understanding of the fact that was, she really didn't. She wasn't like playing me. It was just like, oh, okay, people have a different understanding. So that's another one of these things that we're kind of in the middle of that moment. And I don't know, whether we'll figure it out, or I suppose ultimately we'll decide something, but I don't know where we'll land.
It's a fascinating, and maybe that could be its own episode in some ways, I think. So
about authorship or ownership,
ownership, and that could be fascinating. All right, and this is a really short question. Let's end with this one, just because I really want to say this phrase out loud in a recorded way. Miranda is asking, wants to remind us that words matter. So could you comment on the John Adams wanting to call President George Washington His Highness, the President of the United States and the protector of the rights of the same?
Well, And that's part of what I started out by talking about today, right?
Yeah.
And Adams's explicit reason for that was he was trying to make the president someone who would be reputable on the world stage. And the quote that's associated with that is when someone suggests president of the United States, he says, and this is a paraphrase, but it's pretty close. What will the sailors and soldiers in other nations think? President of the United States, they're presidents of cricket clubs. They will despise him to all eternity, right? The president just doesn't capture or give the right kind of reputation for what this leader is. And as I started out by saying, at that moment in time, when like poof, we created a government, here you go, and there's a new kind of leader and it's not a king, that kind of question really mattered. And John Adams did what he always does, which is says things either out loud or puts them in writing. And sometimes, in this case, he's not using a sense of humor, but often with a sense of humor.
It's a good place to end. I just could not resist. I really just wanted to say that out loud. That was really the point of doing that question.
Is a good place to end.
Well, thanks everybody. I'll turn it over to Joanne to get us out of here. But again, if you like what we're doing here, join us on the web, and please join us for the Equity Summit. Please look for some new materials from us in the next month, and just want to thank everybody for being here today. It's great to see everybody.
Okay. As always, thank you for being here and for making this kind of discourse and discussion possible, because it's what needs to happen right now, and we are part of it. Thank you for all your good questions. And for those of you who want to stick around, we are now segueing into the after party. The difference between the after party and the real episode is that we do not record the after party, and thus we can stray all over the place in what we talk about. If you want to stay for the after party and you have joined us online through the website, just stick around and we will poof become the after party. If you're watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us through the web link. The link is ncheteach.org/conversations. ncheteach.org/conversations. All you need to do is click on that and you will, within a minute, be in the after party. Those of you who are not sticking around, I will see you guys soon. Have a safe, good week. Still recording.
Working on